The candle had burned down to almost nothing. A small flame, barely the width of a finger, throwing just enough light across the table to see the paper beneath her hands. Sarah Grayson sat motionless in the dark cabin behind the smokehouse and stared at what she had made. She had been working on it for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of stolen minutes and sleepless nights. 11 weeks of scraping charcoal across discarded paper. 11 weeks of studying another man's handwriting until the loops and curves of it lived inside her hands like something she had always known. The document in front of her was not real. It was ink on paper, shaped by an enslaved woman who had never been permitted to learn reading or writing, who had taught herself by watching, by memorizing, by practicing in the dirt behind her cabin when everyone else was asleep. But if the men on the road ahead believed it was real, if a slave patrol stopped her and held this paper beneath lantern light and decided in that one critical second that it looked official enough, then it would be as real as anything in the world. Sarah pressed one trembling finger against the signature at the bottom. The ink had dried. The paper held firm. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her coat. Outside, the October darkness lay heavy over Charles County, Maryland. The tobacco fields were silver under the moon. A horse stood waiting in the barn 200 yards away. And somewhere to the south, her daughter Grace slept, without knowing that before sunrise, her mother was going to commit 3 crimes simultaneously. She would forge official documents. She would steal her master's horse. And she would steal herself. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something simple. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Because this story feels different after dark. When the house is quiet, and the world outside has gone still. When you find yourself sitting with a woman who sat alone in a cabin in 1855, holding the most dangerous piece of paper in Maryland, and realized that everything she loved depended on whether 11 weeks of secret practice had been enough. This is the story of Sarah Grayson. She had no last name that history bothered to record. But she had something rarer and more powerful than a name. She had patience. And patience, in the right hands, becomes its own kind of weapon. To understand what Sarah Grayson built in that cabin, you must first understand where she learned to build it. Not from books, not from school. From watching. Sarah was born enslaved in Charles County, Maryland, around 1827. Tobacco country, flat land and heavy summers, and the smell of curing leaves drifting across everything from August through November. The plantation where she was born was not the largest in the county, but it ran with the particular efficiency of a place where suffering had become routine, where cruelty no longer needed to announce itself, because it had been woven so completely into the daily rhythm of things that people simply moved around it the way water moves around stone. Sarah's earliest memory was not of pain. It was of her mother's hands. Ruth. That was her name. A woman with hands that had worked tobacco fields so long they had taken on a permanent curve at the fingers, as though her palms were always slightly cupped, always ready to catch something falling. In the evenings, those hands would braid Sarah's hair, slowly, carefully, while Ruth hummed something without words. Not a song, exactly, just sound. The particular sound a woman makes when she is trying to give her child something warm to hold on to in a world that offers very little warmth. Sarah would close her eyes during those evenings and let the humming fill the cabin. For a few minutes every night, the world reduced to that sound and those hands. And that was enough. It had to be enough. Because under slavery, enough was the best you could ask for. When Sarah was 7 years old, a wagon came. She remembered it was a Tuesday. She remembered the frost on the ground. She remembered the sound before she understood what it meant. Metal on metal. A particular clinking sound she had heard before but never connected to herself or anyone she loved. Until that morning. Ruth was standing in the yard between the quarters and the main house. 2 white men stood near her. The chains were already on. Sarah ran. She covered the distance between the cabin door and her mother in seconds. She grabbed the fabric of Ruth's dress with both fists and held on with everything her 7-year-old body possessed. Her mother's chained hands could not reach far enough to properly hold her, but Ruth lowered her face as close as she could, and she said one sentence that Sarah would carry inside her chest for the next 28 years like a stone she could not put down. "You keep living," Ruth whispered. "You keep living. For both of us." Then the men pulled her away. Sarah held on until the dress tore. She fell into the dirt, and she watched the wagon take her mother down the long road toward the tree line. She watched until the trees swallowed everything. She watched the empty road for a long time after that. Nobody came to move her. Nobody came to explain. The plantation simply continued around her. Bells rang, people went to the fields, work resumed. Because even the worst things that happened at a plantation happened inside a rhythm that did not stop for grief. Sarah sat in the dirt beside the torn piece of her mother's dress, and she learned the first great lesson of her life. The people who controlled her body counted on the people they controlled losing their minds to grief. A woman destroyed by grief was easier to manage. Sarah decided in that moment of cold clarity that sometimes comes to very young children in very terrible situations, that she would not lose her mind. She would keep it. She would use it. She just did not yet know how. Her father, Isaiah, tried to hold what remained of the family together. He was a carpenter, a quiet man who communicated more through the things he made than through words. After Ruth was sold, he built a small wooden box for Sarah. Smooth pine, tight joints. No explanation. Just the box, placed beside her pallet one morning, as though he had worked through the night to have something to give her. She kept Ruth's torn piece of dress inside it. Isaiah lasted 4 more years. The labor broke him first, physically. Then the grief took the rest. He died during a summer so hot the air itself seemed wrong. Sarah was 11 years old when they buried him beside the quarters. Afterward, she sat alone on the step of their cabin for a long time. Then she stood. She went back to work, because that was all that was left. An old woman in the quarters took her in after that. Her name was Mama Cora. Nobody knew her exact age, and she never offered it. Her face had the particular quality of very old faces that have seen everything. Not hard, not soft, just deeply and permanently settled, like riverbed stone. Mama Cora had survived 3 different owners and the sale of 6 children. She had watched slavery perform every cruelty in its repertoire. And yet, she was not broken. That was the remarkable thing. She was not broken. She had found, somewhere in the long years of surviving impossible things, a kind of bedrock inside herself that the system could not reach. And she tried, in her quiet, particular way, to show Sarah where that bedrock was. She taught her practical things: which plants near the swamp reduced fever, which roots, boiled long enough, made pain bearable, how to read weather 3 days ahead by the behavior of birds. But the most important thing Mama Cora ever taught Sarah had nothing to do with plants or birds. It happened one evening when Sarah was 13. She found Mama Cora bent over something near the fire, a smooth, flat stone. And on the stone, traced carefully in charcoal, were shapes. Letters. Sarah had seen letters before, on the plantation owner's documents, on the bills and papers that white men carried and studied. She had always understood vaguely that those shapes meant something, that they carried power somehow. But she had never thought about them as things a person like her could touch. "What are you doing?" she asked. Mama Cora looked up. "Practicing," she said simply. "Practicing what?" The old woman looked back at the stone. Her finger traced one shape, then another. "My children had names," she said quietly. "The people who sold them didn't write the names down correctly. I've been trying to remember how the names should look." Sarah sat beside her. "You know how letters work?" Mama Cora shook her head. "Not fully. I learned pieces, watching, over many years." She paused. "That's how most things work, child. You watch long enough, and the shape of it enters you. Your hands learn before your mind does." Sarah looked at the letters traced on the stone. Something moved inside her chest. Not understanding exactly, something more primitive than understanding. Recognition. As though some part of her had been waiting for this specific moment without knowing it was waiting. "Can you teach me?" she asked. Mama Cora looked at her carefully, then nodded once. They practiced in secret for 3 years, not reading, not writing in the way it is formally taught. Something different. Sarah learned to observe shapes the way a painter observes landscapes, to see the particular weight of a curved line, the height of a letter against the line above it, the distance between words, the way a signature looked like a person's entire personality compressed into motion. She could not sound out words. She could not understand what sentences meant on a page, but she could reproduce shapes with terrifying accuracy. Her hand learned what her mind could not fully translate. She practiced constantly, in the dirt at night, on smooth, flat stones beside the creek, on the insides of worn-out shoes she found discarded near the barn. Anywhere she could make marks without being seen. Mama Cora died in the winter of 1846. She went quietly, in the night, the way people who have made peace with their lives often go. Sarah sat beside her for a long time before telling anyone. She held one of Mama Cora's hands between both of hers, and she thought about everything the old woman had given her. The bedrock, the watching, the understanding that power could be held inside unlikely hands. Then she went back to work, because that was what survival required. And Sarah had learned to survive. In 1848, Sarah became a mother. Her daughter arrived in the middle of a spring rainstorm, small, absolutely and completely Sarah's. They named her Grace, because that was what she was. Not a theological grace, not the formal kind, but the kind that appears unexpectedly in terrible places. The kind that makes continuing feel possible. The kind that, If you are fortunate enough to encounter it, you understand immediately that you would do anything at all, to protect it. Sarah held her daughter that first night and listened to rain on the cabin roof. Outside, the plantation existed as it always had, orders and bells and the machinery of suffering running on schedule. But inside the cabin, for a few hours that first night, the outside world ceased to matter. There was only Grace, her weight, her warmth, the particular sound of her breathing that Sarah's body learned immediately and never forgot. Sarah memorized everything about her daughter the way she had learned to memorize letters, by watching, by absorbing, by allowing the shape of something into her hands. Grace's eyes, Grace's laugh, which came early and came often and sounded like water over stone. The way she asked questions about everything. Why does the tobacco smell that way? Why does the river move? Why don't birds fall when they sleep in trees? Sarah answered every question she could, and for the ones she couldn't answer, she invented answers that felt true enough. Because Grace deserved answers. Grace deserved everything. And beneath that love, constant as breathing, lived the fear. The fear every enslaved mother carried. The knowledge that love under slavery was a vulnerability, that the more you loved, the more they could take, that the system was designed specifically and deliberately to use love as a chain. Sarah had watched it happen her entire life. She had watched her own mother disappear down a road. She had heard the wagons and the chains and the sounds that followed sails. She knew what was coming. Not when, but she knew it was coming. The only question was whether she would be ready. The conversation happened on an October evening in 1855. Sarah was serving supper inside the main house. Colonel Elijah Grayson sat at the head of the table with two guests, local men, landowners, the kind of men who discussed human beings the way other men discuss weather. Not cruelly, exactly, just practically, the way powerful people speak about things they have never had to feel. Sarah moved between the kitchen and the dining room, pouring, clearing, invisible, as she had learned to be. Then she heard Grace's name. She did not react. Every muscle in her body learned stillness in that moment, the same way a deer learns stillness in an open field. She continued pouring, she continued moving. She listened. Colonel Grayson was discussing spring plans, what to keep, what to sell. The girl Grace had grown enough now to fetch a reasonable price. Cotton country buyers were always looking for children that age, easier to train when young, more years of labor available. Perhaps by March, perhaps sooner if a buyer expressed interest. The men ate, the conversation moved on. Sarah carried empty dishes back to the kitchen. She set them down on the wooden counter. She stood there for a moment with both hands pressed flat against the wood. She was 7 years old again. She was in the dirt. She was watching a wagon, the piece of her mother's dress, the wooden box Isaiah had made, the stone and the charcoal letters, Mama Cora's hands. All of it arrived at once. Then something in Sarah Grayson that had never fully closed, finally closed. Quietly. Completely. With a sound only she could hear. Like a door. Like a decision. She picked up the dishes again and went back to work. But she had already begun planning. Sarah had 11 weeks between the night she heard Colonel Grayson's conversation and the night she decided to act. She used every minute. The first challenge was materials, not paper. Discarded paper could be found near the house regularly if you watched carefully and moved quickly. Ink was harder. She could not purchase it, could not request it, could not explain why she needed it without inviting questions she couldn't answer. So she did what Mama Cora had taught her to do with any problem. She observed. She experimented. She improvised. Crushed gallnuts from the oak trees near the creek yielded a brown-black liquid when boiled. Too light at first. She added soot from the cooking fire, measured carefully, adjusted. After 3 weeks of attempts, she had something consistent enough to hold on paper. Not identical to commercial ink, but close enough. Close enough was what mattered. The stamp was harder. Official documents carried seals, impressions pressed into wax or stamped in ink, the mark that told men with authority that the paper was legitimate. Sarah had studied every document that came within her sight for months. She had memorized the approximate size, the general shape, the impression of official weight. She found a piece of pine wood in the scrap pile near the barn. She took a small blade, stolen from the kitchen, replaced before it was missed, and she began carving. The work was slow. Her hands shook sometimes from tension. She carved late at night, every sound making her pause and listen. A dog barking 3 cabins away would stop her hands for several minutes. Footsteps on the path outside would drop her immediately into stillness. She hid the wood during the day beneath a loose board under her sleeping pallet, checked every morning that it was undisturbed. Night after night, week after week, the shape slowly emerged from the wood. Not a perfect reproduction of any official seal she had seen. Something that carried the feeling of official weight, the impression of authority, which, she had learned from years of observation, was often more convincing than actual authority. Because men who believe in systems trust the appearance of systems. They see what they expect to see. If the paper looks right, if the seal looks right, if the person presenting it looks confident and calm, the mind fills in the rest. The forgery itself took 4 complete attempts before she produced something she would trust her life to. The first attempt, the handwriting collapsed at the signature. Too hesitant. She had been holding the pen too carefully, trying too hard, and the result looked nothing like the decisive, confident strokes of someone with authority. She burned it in the cooking fire. The second attempt survived the body of the document, but the seal impression came out too light. Burned. The third survived both, but the words looked too crowded in the left margin. She had noticed that official documents used space deliberately, white space on the page as a signal of authority, of people who had enough paper not to crowd it. Burned. The fourth attempt. She began after midnight. The plantation was deep in silence. The candle was burning low. Her hand moved across the paper slowly but without hesitation. She had practiced each section so many times that her hand knew the path before her mind directed it. The body of the document first. Travel permission granted to a female servant of Colonel E. Grayson, Charles County, Maryland, traveling north on personal errands. Then the date. Then the careful, formal language she had memorized from overheard documents, arranged in the order that felt most official. Then the signature. This was where she had failed before. She paused. She breathed. She thought of Mama Cora's voice. Your hands learn before your mind does. She let her hand move. And the signature came. Not identical to Grayson's, but carrying its rhythm, its weight, its particular downward pressure at the end. She set down the pen. She looked at the document for a long time. Then something strange happened. She would describe it only once, many years later, to a woman she trusted completely. The candle flame beside her went absolutely still. Not extinguished, not flickering. Still. Like breath held. Like something leaning forward to look at what her hands had made. For 3 or 4 seconds, the flame did not move. Then it returned to its ordinary trembling. Sarah looked at the document. She folded it and felt, for the first time in her life, that the thing she had made was exactly what it needed to be. The horse had been the other project. Thunder was Colonel Grayson's prized bay stallion, 16 hands high, broad through the chest, the kind of animal that made people stop walking when he passed. He had won races at the county fair 2 years running. He was valuable beyond calculation. And he had a temperament to match. He did not like strangers. He did not tolerate nervousness. He was the kind of horse that could read a person's fear before the person knew they were afraid. Sarah had never been given reason to work near the stable, so she created reasons. Volunteer work where none was required, carrying water in directions that took her past the stable door, arriving at the kitchen early enough to pass by on the way from the quarters. Slow, patient, unremarkable proximity. She brought offerings, apple cores from the kitchen, oats carried in her apron pocket, dried grass saved carefully. The first time Thunder took anything from her hand, she stood perfectly still afterward for nearly a minute. Not from fear, from gratitude. She began talking to him. Not words exactly, just sound. The same quality of sound Ruth had made while braiding her hair. Low and continuous and warm. Not performing craziness, actually feeling it. Because whatever the situation outside the stable, inside those few minutes near Thunder, she focused entirely on the horse, and nothing else existed. Week by week, the horse changed toward her. His ears came forward when she appeared, his head lowered. He stopped shifting away. By October, he was taking food from her palm with the confident gentleness of an animal that has decided someone is trustworthy. That decision had taken 8 weeks. 8 weeks of patience. 8 weeks of showing up. 8 weeks of offering something without demanding anything in return. Sarah understood, in some wordless way, that she had been teaching the horse the same thing Mama Cora had taught her. That bedrock, that settledness, that quality of being completely present in a moment without panic. The horse had learned to trust her. Now she would ask him to carry her north. She hoped he would forgive the deception. October 12th, 1855. The moon was 3/4 full and sitting high above the Maryland countryside. Sarah waited until the last lantern in the main house went dark. Then she waited another full hour. Patience. She had learned patience. She rose from the pallet in the dark. She dressed in the clothes she had prepared, men's trousers from a discarded pile, a heavy wool coat that fit badly but covered the shape of her. She tucked the forged document inside her coat against her skin. She pressed one hand for a moment against the small wooden box Isaiah had made, Ruth's torn piece of dress inside. She did not take it. She could not carry it safely. But she pressed her hand against the box for a moment and let herself remember the weight of her mother's hands in her hair. Then she walked to the door. She opened it with the slowness that distinguishes people who have thought carefully about sounds from people who haven't. The hinges had been rubbed with cooking grease 3 nights earlier. They made no sound. Outside, the cold struck her immediately. October in Maryland, the particular cold that arrives after harvest. Sharp, honest, the kind of cold that clears the mind. The yard between the quarters and the stable was 60 yards of open ground, no cover, moonlight lying across it like a problem she had to solve. Sarah stepped out. She walked on the grass beside the path rather than on the path itself, softer, quieter. Each foot placed with the deliberate care of someone who has rehearsed this journey so many times in her mind that her body has memorized the route. She reached the stable, pushed the door. The hinges here she had greased 2 nights ago. Also silent. Thunder's stall was on the right. She could hear him breathing in the dark. She spoke before he could sense her strangely. Just sound, that low, continuous, warm sound. His breathing changed. His head turned toward her, ears forward, recognizing. She reached out her hand. He lowered his nose to it. She bridled him with hands that were perfectly steady. She had expected them to shake. They did not. Something in her had gone beyond the place where shaking was available. She was in the place beyond fear, the place where only the task exists. She led Thunder out of the stable, across the yard, through the gate at the north side of the property. She mounted at the fence, using the top rail as a step, swinging her leg over, settling onto his back with a smoothness that surprised her. Thunder shifted once beneath her, then settled. She pressed her legs gently against his sides. He moved forward. First a walk, then a trot. Then, when the darkness of the tree line swallowed them, a canter. North, away from Charles County, away from the main house, away from the tobacco fields, away from the smokehouse where the cabin still held the wooden box. Toward Pennsylvania, toward 200 miles of danger, toward something that had been withheld from her since before she was born. The patrol found her on the second night, not looking for her specifically, not yet. Just 2 men on horseback working the roads between Port Tobacco and La Plata, checking. The way men check things when the Fugitive Slave Act has given them authority, and that authority has become habit. Sarah heard them before she saw their lantern. She had already hidden Thunder in a thicket once today, spent the daylight hours motionless while riders passed on a nearby road, and she had developed in that stillness a particular sensitivity to approaching sound. She did not run. Running was the wrong response. Running confirmed guilt before anyone had accused her of anything. She continued riding at a steady pace. Let them come to her. Let everything in her body say, woman on an errand, not woman on a flight. The riders came alongside her, 2 of them, one older, one younger. The older one held the lantern higher as they slowed beside her. His name, she would learn later through abolitionist networks, was Deputy Samuel Cross. He had been working patrol roads in Charles County for 11 years. He had returned more than 40 runaways to bondage in that time. He was not a stupid man. He was not a careless man. And something about the woman on the bay horse was not quite right to him. He couldn't have said what, just a quality, something underneath the calm. "Hold up," he said. Sarah stopped Thunder. She looked at the deputy with the expression she had practiced, not defiant, not frightened. The expression of someone who has a perfectly legitimate reason for being on this road and is mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. "Papers," Cross said. Sarah reached into her coat, removed the folded document, handed it across without hesitation. Cross unfolded it, held it up to the lantern. She watched his eyes move across the words. She watched them stop at the signature. She watched him look up at her, then back at the paper, then at her again. She held his gaze without difficulty. This had surprised her during the rehearsals. She had expected holding the gaze to be the hardest part. Instead, it was the easiest. Because she was telling the truth about the most important thing. She was a person. She was going somewhere. She had the right to go there. The document was the lie. The woman presenting it was not. And somewhere in that particular quality of absolute truth beneath deception, something read as authentic. Cross studied the document for a long time, a very long time. The younger deputy shifted in his saddle. Thunder stood perfectly still. Sarah breathed slowly. She thought of nothing except the present moment. Not Grace, not Pennsylvania, not the 100 miles still between her and freedom. Only this moment, only this breath, only this man's face above a piece of paper she had made with her own hands. Later, Samuel Cross would make one entry in his patrol log about this encounter. Historians would find it years afterward. It read only, "Traveling female, documents in order, continued north." He never explained why he cleared her. After the war, after emancipation, after the world changed in ways that made former patrol deputies reassess their years of work, Cross made one public statement about his time in that role. He said there was one stop on one October night that he still thought about, that something told him to look more carefully at the papers, that something else told him to hand them back. He could not explain the second feeling. He said it arrived like a hand placed gently on his shoulder from behind. He turned to look. Nothing was there. He handed the papers back. He told himself it was nothing. He never quite believed that. The nights that followed had their own particular character, each one different, each one carrying new danger alongside new distance. She rode through forests that had no roads she could find. She crossed creeks in darkness, feeling for bottom with each step, trusting Thunder's footing more than her own judgment. She spent one entire day hidden in the hollow of a fallen sycamore tree while a search party, organized now, specific, looking for a woman and a bay horse, moved through the woods 1/2 mile north of her position. She heard the dogs. They passed. She did not breathe for a very long time after the sound faded. She ran out of food on the 5th day. Hunger arrived as a noise in her body first, then as a fogging of thought that she fought constantly. She ate whatever she could find: creek water, hickory nuts, a handful of dried berries she could not identify but ate anyway because the alternative was collapsing from weakness. She made a mistake on the 7th night. Exhaustion. She took the wrong road at a fork and rode an hour west before the terrain disagreed with her. She turned around. She rode back. She continued north. She did not allow herself to calculate what the mistake had cost her. Only forward mattered. Only the next mile, the next hour, the next decision. On the 9th night, something happened that she spent the rest of her life thinking about. She was riding through a stretch of open farmland, the moon behind clouds, the dark absolute around her. Thunder had been stumbling occasionally from fatigue. She was leaning forward, speaking to him, trying to help him stay steady. She was not thinking about direction. She was thinking only about the horse. Then the clouds shifted, and the moon came out. And in the sudden silver light, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line ahead. Not threatening, not moving, just standing. The figure was a woman. She could not see her face, the distance was too great. But something about the posture, the particular angle of the shoulders, the slight curve forward, the way the hands hung, slightly cupped at the palms as though always ready to catch something falling. Sarah pulled Thunder up. She stared. The clouds moved again. The moonlight shifted. She blinked. And the tree line was empty. Only trees. Only darkness. Only wind. Thunder moved forward again without her asking him to. His ears were forward. His pace was certain, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Sarah let him walk. And she did not look back at the tree line. Dawn found her climbing a long ridge above a river valley. The sky was pink and gold behind her. Autumn trees on the ridge held their last color. Below, the valley spread quiet in the early light. And at the far edge of visible distance, a road sign. She could not read it, but a man she had met 2 nights earlier, a free black farmhand who had taken her water without asking questions and pointed her north, had described what the Pennsylvania border looked like from this specific ridge. "You'll know it," he had said simply. "The land looks the same on both sides. But you'll know." She rode Thunder down the ridge, across the valley, up the long, shallow rise on the far side. And when she crossed the line that had no fence, no marker, no official indication of its existence, she knew. She did not know how she knew. She simply did. The same way she had known years ago, sitting beside Mama Cora with charcoal on stone, that something was opening inside her that had always been there, waiting. She stopped Thunder on a flat stretch of road. She sat on his back for a long time without moving. She did not cry immediately. The tears came slowly, not the theatrical tears of dramatic moments. The other kind. The kind that belong to the body before the mind has fully understood what has happened. Her shoulders dropped. Her chest opened. Her hands loosened in Thunder's mane. She pressed both palms against his neck. The horse stood steady beneath her, patient, as though he understood that this moment required stillness. Finally, she slid from his back. Her legs held her, barely. She stood on Pennsylvania soil and said one word aloud. Grace. Not God, not freedom, not thank you. Grace. Because reaching Pennsylvania had never been the destination. It was only the beginning of the real work. The abolitionist networks in southern Pennsylvania were more organized than Sarah had expected. Not perfectly organized. Nothing was perfect. But there were people. A Quaker family outside Gettysburg who gave her food and 3 days of rest without asking for anything. A free black community in York whose members passed information through church gatherings that looked to outside eyes like ordinary worship. A network of connections that moved names and messages and people northward through channels that left almost no paper record. Sarah stayed long enough to recover, long enough to let Thunder rest, though she refused to sell him. People offered her money for the horse. She declined every time. He had carried her 200 miles through October darkness. She owed him more than a sale price. Then she turned her attention south, toward Grace. The plan for Grace took longer than her own escape. 6 months of careful work. Messages passed through networks. A free black man who traveled legitimately through Charles County as part of his trade. A route established and tested. The timing of a patrol absence identified. A specific night, a specific road, a specific signal. On the night it happened, Sarah was 50 miles north of the Maryland border, waiting at a farmhouse, unable to sleep, walking the perimeter of the yard in the dark. She had done everything she could do. The rest was in hands she could not control. She walked and waited, and sometime in the early morning hours, the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road reached her. She stood absolutely still. The wagon slowed. A man climbed down from the seat, opened the back, and a small figure jumped out and ran. Sarah was already moving. They met somewhere in the middle of the yard between the farmhouse and the road. She dropped to her knees. Her daughter ran into her. Neither of them made a sound. They simply held on. The way people hold on when they have practiced the letting go of each other in their minds so many times that the actual holding feels almost too real to survive. Sarah pressed her face against Grace's hair, breathed. The smell of her daughter, the weight of her, the particular warmth. All of it exactly as she had memorized. All of it still there. Nothing taken, nothing sold, nothing gone. History kept only fragments of Sarah Grayson. It did not think her worth full documentation. She was not famous. She held no office. She wrote no books. She gave no famous speeches. She was an enslaved woman who forged a document and stole a horse and rode north to save her daughter. And then she kept living. She settled in York County, Pennsylvania. She worked. She built something small and solid and hers. She raised Grace. She watched her daughter grow into a young woman who asked questions about everything and had her grandmother Ruth's particular quality of alertness, those eyes that missed nothing. Sarah told Grace about Ruth, about the hands, the humming, the piece of dress in the box. She told her about Isaiah and his carpenter's silence and the smooth wooden box he made in a night of grief. She told her about Mama Cora and the charcoal letters on the flat stone. About how watching is its own kind of learning. About how patience is its own kind of weapon. About how the body can know things before the mind understands them. Grace listened to all of it and carried it forward, as children do. Thunder lived 11 more years in Pennsylvania. He was never raced again. He grazed in a small pasture that Sarah rented at the edge of the property. Every morning she brought him something, an apple, a handful of oats, whatever she had. The same exchange they had built over those 8 weeks in Maryland. He died in the spring of 1866, 1 year after slavery was abolished. Sarah buried him beneath a hickory tree at the edge of the pasture. She marked the spot with a flat stone. The stone is still there. Nobody knows that's what it marks, but it's there. Samuel Cross resigned from his position as a patrol deputy in 1857. He never publicly explained why. He moved to a farm in western Maryland. He became, by all accounts, a quieter man than he had been. He attended a small Methodist church. He rarely discussed his years working patrol roads. One account, written down by a church member who knew him in his later years, mentions that Cross sometimes spoke about a night when he cleared a woman on a road and then spent the rest of his life wondering about it. He said he had examined the document and known something was wrong with it. He could not explain why he handed it back anyway. He said he had felt something behind him, like a presence. He said he turned to look. Nothing was there. Only the road, only the dark, only the cold October air. He handed the papers back, and 30 years later, he was still thinking about it. Charles County still exists. The tobacco country, the flat land, the long roads between farms where satellite navigation now guides drivers who would have been lost generations ago. The plantation where Sarah Grayson was born is long since gone. The main house, the stable, the quarters, the smokehouse where she carved the stamp and mixed the ink and practiced by candlelight. All of it replaced by time and weather and the ordinary progress of a world that moves forward, whether or not it stops to remember what it passes over. But some things persist despite the moving forward. People who live near the old property report small things. A candle flame that goes still sometimes. Completely still. No wind, no draft. Simply motionless for a few seconds, then returning to its ordinary trembling. Local families warn children not to linger on certain stretches of the back road after dark. Not because anything dangerous is there, only because the road feels like it remembers something. Like it has absorbed the particular quality of a woman riding north through October darkness and has never fully released it. And sometimes, not often, someone standing very still on that road at a certain hour claims they can hear it. Hoofbeats, moving north. Steady, patient, certain. Before you close your eyes tonight, think about what you have ever made with your own hands that no one expected you to be able to make. Think about the thing you taught yourself by watching, by practicing in the dark, by failing and trying again and failing and trying again until your hands knew the path before your mind directed them. Think about the thing you built, or the distance you crossed, or the decision you made when everyone around you assumed the decision was beyond you. Sarah Grayson could not read the document she forged. She had never been permitted to learn. But she had watched. She had practiced. She had let her hands learn what her circumstances refused to teach her. And she used that to cross 200 miles of darkness toward the thing she loved most. Not because she was exceptional, not because she was fearless, because she had one thing that the system holding her could not take. Her mind, her patience, her absolute refusal to believe that the walls built around her were permanent. If you have ever looked at something impossible and decided to learn the shape of it anyway, if you have ever protected someone you love by becoming something no one expected you to become, if you have ever made something with your hands in the dark, alone, when no one was watching, that turned out to be exactly what it needed to be, then you already understand Sarah Grayson. You have always understood her. Subscribe to Footnotes of Fear, because the footnotes are where the true stories live. The ones that didn't make the history books. The ones that survived anyway. And the next story is already waiting in the dark, where a candle flame goes still, and a woman's hands move across paper. And something that was impossible becomes exactly what it needs to be.